Okay, I hope the reality lives up to the image in the movie. Frequently it doesn't, and they say you should never meet your heroes. Well, you're just about to go on to meet one here. And unfortunately, well, perhaps fortunately, because they say you should say things twice so that people will remember them, there will be some amount of repetition from what was in that excellent DVD made by Cliff and Brendan and my lecture, because we're talking about the same man, same topic, same theme, same times. So again, I start with his life, his birth, and as anybody who's written a book would know, the most difficult thing to find is an opening line. And I found a perfect opening line, and then the fucking JA went and destroyed it. So in future years, people are going to say, what was this idiot saying when he wrote that book in 2016? And my wonderful opening line was that there are 3 dates set in stone. 1st September, All-Ireland Hurling. 3rd of September, All-Ireland Football. And then I found that in the second Sunday in September, due to the efforts of the Reverend Jeffers, a second significant Sunday had developed in West Cork, where the Dohonys, the local GA football club, went to visit St Mary's. This was an unusual thing, that GA clubs don't normally process to the local Protestant church for ceremonies at any point in their existence or careers. But in this case, Cliff had developed the idea that the GA club and the community in general would come to Sam Maguire's grave to honour Sam's memory. The gravestone is, as you can see, rather vaguely there, and I was talking to a member of the Kingston family last night who told me he was old enough to have seen that stone when it was hit by lightning back in the 1950s or 1940s. His job was to cut the grass in the Protestant churchyard, and he was one of the first to see the fallen stone. So what we have there now is a replica of the original stone, because the original stone was literally destroyed by lightning. So Tommy Kingston, take a bow for your excellent observations of broken stones. So his religion, as we saw earlier, was Anglican, and to many people outside Dunmanway in West Cork, that's quite a surprise. But from the census returns at the time, in 1911, the population of Dunmanway was 12% Protestant, and it would not be unexceptional then for Sam to have been born into that religion. So we had at the time, which was quite amazing when I went to UCC and met people who had never met a Protestant, that we had 3 Protestant churches in town, the Anglican, the Methodist, and a group of people that were called Dippers, who believed in fundamental rights of baptism in rivers, etc. So that was his religion. Birthplace, born in Malabraca, on what seemed like a very big piece of land, 200 acres, but most of it was very poor land. And the proof of that now is that most of the land is now under forestry, because it was not much used for agricultural purposes. So somebody said to me last night as well, getting a lot of information here at this place, that they hadn't a penny to rub together, which is the phrase that people use about poor people, hadn't 2 pennies to rub together. Because as with many people, when Sam Maguire became famous, legends began to adhere to his name about his heroics in various fields, etc. And it was said that they were very wealthy people, very generous to their neighbours, and that Sam never left a pub without buying a round for everybody in the pub several times in Dunmanway. But I think all these stories are simply glorious accretions to the legend to make things seem better. Family, as mentioned, Willie stayed at home, and the eldest son managed the farm. Mary never married. Jack and Dick went to work in the post office with Sam, and both died from TB. Paul married a Catholic, which at that time was obviously not accepted in any shape or form, and he went to America, where they both married, and their ancestor is a Catholic priest. There are no direct descendants of the Maguire family. They are in-laws or bylaws, if you want to call them like that. The last remaining sister was Molly, and she ended up in Dunmanway. And my Kingston informant also tells me that he saw her in the pew in the Protestant church in Dunmanway. And if young people were misbehaving in nearby pews, she was more than willing to tell them to cut themselves on, which I'm sure the Mr. Reverend Kingston would do now as well, if he had to do it. So this is the old house in Malabraca. The Land Brothers have set up Sam Maguire holiday cottages or homes, and they rebuilt the house in this format here. But as you can see, I think clearly, that there is an extra wing added there on the left-hand side, but still has to be recognised that they did at least repair it because it had gone into rack and ruin completely. So there were two significant events that affected his career. First of all, the education system in Ireland. Education in Ireland began with the national schools in 1832. They also created a system of model schools, and these model schools were designed to inculcate the best training practices, teaching practices for teachers. And luckily for Maguire, such a school was opened in Dunmanway, which is still present today, a beautiful building, very well preserved, and his classroom and his name in the register are all preserved there in very good fashion. He attended the model school until 7th class, got an excellent education, but what's important for his subsequent career is that there was no reference to Irish history. The history they were taught was British imperial history. The mathematics questions would ask about the distance from London to Calcutta. If a ship travelling at 25 knots had to travel from London to Calcutta, how many days or hours or weeks would it take? The second was the method of change in the English Post Office and Civil Service. The change in recruitment was first proposed by Charles Trevelyan, who is the author or mentioned in the famous song The Fields of Athenry. He described one gentleman as a gentleman who could neither read nor write. He was almost an idiot. So at that time you were appointed to civil service if you had right family connections or the right surname. He proposed the use of competitive examinations. Queen Victoria said that will encourage the wrong type of person, and she was dead right, because Michael Collins, Sam Maguire and a large range of other Republicans were brought from Ireland to England into the English civil service. They also opposed it, which is very interesting. This was the 1850s, because it was too German. So Brexit was never far from their minds in that situation. Too German, too efficient, not like the old-style English inefficiency, which at least encouraged the rise of gentlemen, if nothing else. So the creation of these schools, being Q tours as we always are, the Irish took advantage immediately and said, these people are now giving us permanent pensionable jobs, of which we have few or none in Ireland, and these idiots are now giving us the chance to live off them. So immediately people started preparing for these examinations set up by Trevelyan. Michael Cusack made a very large amount of money running a grind school in Dublin, where he earned a very large income from preparing people for the police and the civil service exams. And in our field, about 10 miles from Dunmanway, another national school called the University of the Mountains was set up by Master Madden. Master Madden did it for his salary alone, did not run a private grind school, took children from all over to schools all over West Cork, and he was an incredibly talented and wonderful teacher. Having won the competition that they had at that time so many times, he said, we'll give others a chance to win, I'll withdraw this time. It became known as the University of the Mountains, because our field, I think, translates literally as the high field of the rocks or something like that, and this school was built on the height of the rocks. So he was quite an inspiration to Maguire, because I suspect that this is the first place where Maguire held about Irish history. And Madden was an extreme nationalist. He has supposedly been involved with the Fenians in 1867, and his father had been involved in 1848. When O'Donovan Ross's funeral took place in 1915, he travelled all the way from Ardfield to O'Donovan Ross's funeral, and that would have been a long, arduous, expensive trip, and I suspect somebody told him, this is an important event, you must be there, which led me to believe that he might have been a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or the IRB, and that would also influence Maguire, obviously. So I think Maguire's change in direction came from this school at this particular point in time, and that was the influence of Master Madden. There is a suggestion Collins went to this school, but he went to a similar school in Clonakilty, which did exactly the same job of preparing people for the English civil service. So there was a large amount of immigration to England after the famine, and immigration continues obviously to the present day. But this is a description of the first generation of Irish who left Ireland after 1848. So they said about the famine, 1 million dead and 1 million fled. So a large number of that million went to England because it was the cheapest and most convenient place to go. And this is how Geroda Tuig, a prominent historian of this particular period, written many articles and books on the period, described the Irish and you can see that it's a frightening and awful description of the conditions in which these poor people had to live. These people became the subject of punch cartoons and racist jokes, of which we see here. Frequently we were depicted as having the faces of apes, because at that time I think Darwin's theory had come out, and we were supposed to be all descended from the ape then, so they took that and made a joke of it and described us as the modern ape, or the living version of the modern ape. And in the next picture we find a very interesting example of this. On the right hand side here we have Bridget McBruiser, and on the left hand side we have Florence Nightingale. So we can see, look on this picture and then on that, Shakespeare. So look on Florence Nightingale and then look at the horrible example of the Irish femininity on the right hand side. So this is the generation that immigrated before Sam Maguire. We then come to Sam Maguire's generation, including Michael Collins, and this was an entirely different group of people. They were educated, they were coming to take up permanent jobs. The permanent job guaranteed them an income, but more importantly gave them leisure time for political and social and sporting activities. So they now had a job, they had an income and they had leisure, and they turned that to very powerful use. So the leisure time was divided in between the GAA and the Irish Republican Army. So the importance of the work in the new post office, the new kind of Irish, there's a wonderful phrase there from the Roy Foster in that excellent book, Vivid Faces, where he describes this pattern of subversion extending from the south of Ireland into the heart of metropolitan London via the Royal Mail. Beautiful analogy and image. And the idea is, as he says there, that there was a direct line of subversion from the schools in West Cork to the middle of the empire in London at the heart of its power. Two organisations influenced his life: the Irish Republican Brotherhood, also known as the Fenians, founded in Dublin in March 1858, and the Gaelic Athletic Association, founded in Thurles in November 1884. And in the early years of the GAA, the IRB, or Republican Brotherhood, was very powerful in the GAA in organising and attempting to control the GAA, and in effect the two organisations were very, very similar in their membership, at least their secret membership anyway. The GAA in London was founded in 1896, 12 years after the founding of the GAA. Liam McCarthy was appointed as the board secretary, and he's the man after whom the hurling cup is named. Himself and Sam Maguire seem to have a very close relationship, because we'll see now in a moment. His organisational, he was treasurer of his club, Hibernians, but most importantly is that himself and McCarthy appeared to alternate the first and second positions over the years of the early 1900s. That McCarthy would be president one year, vice president would be Maguire. The following year they'd flip roles, and they'd flip roles again, a bit like Vladimir Putin in Russia, sort of flipping roles and saying, we're different people, this is still a democracy, we're different people. So he has a very strong role in the organisation of the GAA. He played in in a very nice phrase by Owen Corrie in the GAA in 1901 made England the province of Ireland, which is a very fine thing for a nationalist organisation to do. Something that should have been done 100,000 years before, really, would have avoided all the troubles. If we'd made them a province in 1066 or whatever it was, 1169, things would have been much handier. We'd have killed them instead of them killing us. So they made it a province of the GAA. The 32 counties played in the normal All-Ireland as we know it. The winner of that would then play the winner of the English Championship in what was called the away final. The away final was frequently delayed, and the result was that GAA was very badly organised. Finals would take place typically 2 or 3 years after the calendar year in which it should have been played. The 1902 final was played in 1904, and that was the first match played in the athletic grounds in Cork. And after that, the Lord Mayor invited the Gaelic football team from London to a dinner, and they said, shag off, Lord Mayor, because you're going to a rugby club tomorrow night, and we're not going to have anything to do with you. And you also allowed British soldiers in uniform into the athletic grounds. You can stop consorting with the enemy, if you want to put it like that. So Maguire and his colleagues were very strong nationalists from the very start. This is a picture of the team, and this is a picture of, this is Sam here, and I think there is brothers beside him. So Sam Maguire represented London. I hate to be contradicting my colleagues here. In several away finals, 1901, etc. And just like the London teams of today, they were always badly beaten. They could not compete with the home teams, and it became a farce really, to the point where eventually they said we'll scrap this away final because it's probably attracting very small audiences. The press are reporting very poor games, and there's no point in continuing the pain really. So London were removed. So Sam Maguire's role then, he was the main representative of Michael Collins in London, and he became the figure to which every one of Collins' agents was sent. Any time a man went to London, he was sent to Sam Maguire. He was involved in arms smuggling, and they had a very efficient shipping system across the Irish Sea from Dublin to Liverpool, or Liverpool to Dublin. The guns would be located in what looked like ordinary commercial boxes or crates. They would be specially marked, and the IRA would know in Dublin which crates were theirs by the marks that were placed on them, and they would be placed in convenient places where the IRA in Dublin could open them. There's a very funny story here told by the Bureau of Military History. So it tells you the kind of people they had to associate with. Ginger Barnett in Petticoat Lane in the East End, and a half-caste named Darby the Coon. The latter could best be described as a gang leader. So they paid him £100 to start off, and with the assistance of Barnett and Darby, we purchased 2 or 3 revolvers or automatics each week. So he had to go down into the depths of the London underworld, if you want to go looking for guns, because that was the only place, obviously, that you would find guns. But it's a very witty and interesting description from a witness to the Bureau of Military History. Intercepting the mail, obviously that was an important thing in the post office. Frank Thornton, whom we might get a chance to meet again, talked about the very efficient correspondence system that Maguire created between Dublin and London to keep the lines of communication open. The postal system was very fast. Percival, for anybody from West Cork, is a name that conjures up images of horror, I suppose. He was based in Bandon, and Tom Barry in Good Old Days of Ireland described him as the most vicious anti-Irish officers of all serving British officers. In notorious incidents, the Essex Regiment, of which he was in charge, tortured Tom Hales and Pat Hart. Hales died later on the asylum in Cork, and Barry went into Bandon on several occasions, which was a very dangerous thing for him to do because it was heavily patrolled by the military. Went into Bandon several times to try to assassinate Percival. So they heard that Percival was going to holiday in the south of England, and they thought they might get a shot when he was changing trains in London. So Collins sent over a team, Frank Thornton, Bill Ahern, Pam Murray and Tiger Sullivan. They waited at the station for Percival to arrive to change trains. Sam Maguire suddenly arrived across the road, frantically waving his hands at them, standing outside the station, and they were amazed to see this, because Sam was a very discreet and very retiring person who didn't put himself up in public, and he told them that the plan had been informed on to the authorities, and they were on their way to arrest the gang. So they arrived 5 minutes after the group had left. Then there was a terrible PS to this story. Thornton accompanied O'Sullivan to put him on a ship to Cork. On the next night, he was crossing O'Connell Bridge, and he bought the evening paper, and he found a headline, Tiger O'Sullivan shot in Cork. So what was happening was O'Sullivan was going to a battalion commander's meeting. He saw that there was a military raiding party about to break into the house. He attracted their attention, ran away in front of them, perhaps fired the shot at them, and they shot him down. So that's why he was shot, but he saved the battalion command structure, which was what he died for. So the Irish Civil War started in 1922. Treaty opponents described as irregulars. Michael Collins shot, and armed anti-treaty forces dumped arms in May 1923. Sam Maguire worked in the post office, and he returned to work in the post office in 1923 because his friend J.J. Walsh from Bandon, Cork people look after Cork people, was in charge of the Department of Post and Telegraphs, and he suggested that Sam should come home and he would give him a job. So there is also a suggestion he may have been involved in the assassination of the leader of the British Army, the retired leader of the British Army, Sir Henry Wilson, and he may have left to avoid arrest. Now, whatever the cause is anyway, he returned to Ireland, and then he fell into another maelstrom. Because in 1924, at the end of the Civil War, The Army had over 50,000 soldiers and 3,000 officers. The current target for the Irish Army is 9,500 men and officers. So obviously in 1924 the state could not afford and did not need 53,000 people in the Army, which they could not pay and for which they had no role to play. So it was necessary to demobilise soldiers. The problem was who was to be dismissed. Because if you were dismissed, you lost your job, and it was very hard to find another job. You'd perhaps have to immigrate. So this was very contentious in the Army. The Army then mutinied and said that they would not accept the orders of the government to hand in their uniforms and weapons. And there was an attempt at an army mutiny in March 1924. This collapsed, and the soldiers, as the phrase has it, went back to barracks. Sam Maguire is supposed to have, by John M. Regan, the only real incitement to violence came within the Irish Republican organisation came from Sam Maguire. He urged the army officers to assassinate senior ministers, and that was his role, according to John M. Regan, as I said, who has written the authoritative histories of the period. That's his reckoning of Maguire's involvement. So he wasn't, but despite his view, Sam was not dismissed from the office in March 1924. On the 29th of December 1924, he was dismissed from his job in the post office. He was dismissed without receiving a pension, and it was suggested that he brought home a pension or a lump sum. But I don't think this is the case, because I believe the story myself, and when I was writing the book, I kept writing to the UK Post Office Archive. Very intelligent, very nice people, very professional people. And they kept saying to me, we have no record of this pension being paid to this man. Please desist, don't be sending us any more emails. So I desisted, but then I went to London, and I went to the Post Office Archive. I went into the counter and I said, I'm inquiring about the records of Sam Maguire. And suddenly down from the back, this man came up, I know who you are. So they did show me the records, and there was no record of a pension. And I think if you had worked as a postal sorter for 20 years in London in that era, you would not expect a big pension. If you worked in Ireland now as a postal sorter for 20 years, you would not expect a huge pension, or perhaps even any pension at all. So Labour Party TD said Sam Maguire was not given basic justice in his dismissal from the civil servants, and had been treated far worse than many other people who had committed much greater crimes against the government. And the reply of Kevin O'Higgins, then the Minister for Justice, is very interesting. He said, Kevin O'Higgins replied, the information had been received from sources which could not be disclosed, and this would mean that people would die if that information were disclosed. So Higgins decided that he would not ever release the evidence against Maguire, or the reason why Maguire would not be given a fair trial. Inadvisable, impossible, in fact, to table evidence in support of that charge, because to table evidence would reveal the source, and to reveal the source would lead to casualties, and the deputy knows it. So I don't know if in the Free State Archives there are documents relating to this, but that was what was stated publicly in the Dáil, our record anyway, about this dismissal. So he returned to the Manway, died of tuberculosis, and then a committee of very prominent people came together. Mark Ryan, I just discovered in the hotel last night in the picture, was with Michael Collins in Frongok prison camp after 1916. Patrick McCartan, Frank Fahey, Patrick Belton became Fine Gael TD, Michael Maloney, loyal and trusted courier of Collins, James Kerwin, Public News headquarters were used by Collins for his headquarters, all very prominent and worthy people. So they came together and decided they would donate money for a cup in his name. So it's interesting that the Johnson & Johnson, Hopkins & Hopkins, there was a cup around that time called Corn na Dála, which had been promoted by the Free State, given by the Free State, to intermediate schools for the speaking of Irish. And if you look at this cup, you see that it's very, very similar to the Sam Maguire cup, and it was made by the same company who subsequently made the Sam Maguire cup. So this company, Hopkins & Hopkins, made these cups because they had the right to print or use the image of the Ardagh chalice. They made these Corn na Dála, as they're called, and that was based on the Ardagh chalice, which was specifically chosen because it preceded Protestant and Catholic. It preceded Free State and Republican and was everybody's neutral symbol, if you like, from that perspective. So as you can see there, it's a very, very similar style and design between the two beautiful objects. First winner, Kildare, etc. So there, yeah, Sam Maguire Cup. The other Sam Maguire, interestingly, at the same time as G in Dublin was proposing a Sam Maguire Cup, in London they hit on the same idea, which gives you some idea of the respect that they had for this man on both sides of the channel. That at the time of his death, both sides said, we'll give a cup in his name, and this is the British version of the cup, which is for the British Junior Inter-County Cup, and there we have your man again, that terrible person,